Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. My guest today is the highly sought after political scientist from Norway, Glenn Diesen. And today we debate the question, have we crossed the point of no return, moving from the unipolar world to multipolarity? And if so, how are the major power players trying to influence that outcome? And a fascinating conversation today. I know you're going to enjoy this. Glenn is a very important voice in geopolitics, and I'm grateful to have had him on the show today. Here is Glenn Diesen. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am, joined by Glenn Diesen. Glenn, thank you so much for making the time to come on today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So there's lots I want to talk to you about. First and foremost, welcome back to YouTube. I know you were banned and you just got approved to come back on. And I want to talk about that because as a creator, this is front and center for all of us all the time, right? When are we on the red line? And you were removed from the platform just recently, I think within the last week, let back on. So good to have you back for sure. You're a very important voice. Here's where I want to start. We're going to get to that. When it comes to, geopolitical events right now, Glenn, what strikes you as the biggest one that the public or the media are misunderstanding or interpreting incorrectly?
Well, I think I think most are picking up on correctly that the U.S. economic hegemonic system has come to an end. That is, in which the world economy is organized under the U.S. administration. I do think there's some misconceptions. One is that the US might be losing a hegemonic position to China. I think this is wrong. I think the Chinese are actually pushing for a multipolar system, which is why they're also becoming a more attractive partner for the rest of the world. But it's also the assumption that the Chinese can be broken, much like the Russians, with sanctions. But I think it's too late for this, simply because the multipolar system is already here, and this allows China and others to diversify, and that's what we've seen over and over again. And the problem then is when the Western countries impose these sanctions, they actually end up isolating themselves because they hand over a huge market share to other countries. So I think, these are around the main areas where there's some misconception.
So to summarize a little bit, what you've seen is American sanctions, which have really surged in the last 4 years, are counterproductive and that they almost act like stimulus for emerging economies. Because if we can't do business with the US, we'll take our business elsewhere. And we've seen this in Russia, redirecting their economy eastward, for example. Maybe that's what you're referring to. And although the media and the public seems to agree that the US hegemony is coming to a close, there's dispute about what happens next. And a common narrative is that China will be the new unipolar superpower. You're saying, no, absolutely not. And that's not even what China wants. China wants multipolarity. Is that correct? Did I summarize that okay?
Yeah, that's very correct. So I often use the analytical framework of how China, as well as Russia for that sake, are developing their economy. I often compare it to the American system. That is when the United States attempted to reduce its dependence on Britain, because at that time, 200 years ago, the Americans also had this three-pillared decoupling. That is, they pursued a manufacturing base, that is the strategic industries. They were developing their own ports and roads for physical connectivity, and they're also pushing a national bank, as they recognized some financial independence was also required if they were going to preserve their political independence. Now, my point is that the Chinese and the Russians are, but again, the Chinese are probably the most important one. They're following a similar recipe or model. That is, they're trying to develop the most advanced technologies. They're pushing this Belt and Road initiative, investing trillions of dollars of having new physical connectivity around the world with new infrastructure. And last, on the financial instrument, we see that they are de-dollarizing, they are pushing a new development banks, digital payment systems, and other ways of becoming less reliant on the United States. So this is seen as being counter-hegemonic. But as we see, because the Chinese don't demand that other countries adhere only to their system, it makes them often more attractive, because in contrast, we see the United States attempting often to have this logic of us versus them. That is, you either have to be with us or with the adversary. So this results in a lot of sanctions and economic coercion. So, for example, trying to roll back the Chinese tech sector with this chip ban, putting perhaps some threats on physical connectivity by cutting off important choke points. We have the case of theft of the Russian sovereign funds, and overall there's a lot of sanctions, including secondary sanctions, which makes it very difficult for the rest of the world to continue trading. That is, they never know what area of the economy will, or what part of the supply chain might be disrupted. So they're looking for alternatives at the moment, ideally in a multipolar, multi-vector system, and this is what the Chinese are facilitating.
So in a counterproductive way, in a counterintuitive way, American sanctions are the fuel that is multipolarity, that is fueling multipolarity. Because if you have a system that functions, maybe the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency or as the trade currency, and you're China or Russia, and you don't love it, right? But it functions well enough that you're going to maintain status quo because there's not a better option. Sanctions are the push to move development of new monetary rails that didn't exist prior, because this current monetary system has become less and less comfortable for these other economies to utilize, motivating them to create the alternative. Yes?
Yes, and I think that this is why this is very predictable. This is indicators of a declining hegemon. If you look at the British in the mid-19th century, or the United States in the mid-20th century, when they had this enormous concentration of economic power, they have the opportunity to act as a benign hegemon. That is, they can promote a very open, liberal international economic system, given that they would like to encourage trust. That is, trust in dependence on their technologies, trust in using transportation corridors under their maritime control, that is under their navy, trust in their banks, trust in their currency. So effectively constructing an international economy under their administration. So you have this incentive then to promote trust. However, what we also see is when a hegemon is in decline, it has incentives to prevent the rise of rivals. So most obviously China. And then there's this incentive to use this administrative control over the international economy to prevent them from rising. But again, what is very predictable to happen, and the more the US attempts to punish and prevent other countries from rising, other poles of power that is, the more incentives they have to decouple from the United States. And you also see that the different centers of power have more incentives to cooperate, to collectively reduce dependence on the United States. And so you see this organization, probably most prominently BRICS, which you have countries from all over the world now, because it's BRICS Plus, with the sole objective of seeking to construct a new economic infrastructure which isn't so vulnerable to American coercion.
I'd love to get your perspective on something, Glenn, because we could talk about the American hegemony. It's in decline. The American establishment does not favor that decline, and so they're fighting back to maintain their supremacy, to maintain the unipolar world. And intuitively, we could maybe say, oh, that makes sense. Whenever you're the top dog, you want to protect your position. And that's a fine anecdote, but it's not really detailed enough to explain the situation. And what I'd love to hear from you is, what is the downside? What is the downside to the American economy, to the American public, or to the American establishment of the migration from unipolar to multipolar? Why is this something, is it something that Americans should fear or be wary of? And if so, why is that the case?
Well, it's obvious benefits to be the only game in town. So if you look at the currency, for example, this is there's a reason why the United States insisted on having the sole reserve currency after the Second World War. Keep in mind that the British were pushing for a basket of currencies in which the pound would also be a part of this trading and reserve currency. But instead, the US insisted on it, and we've seen the benefit. When you print the world's reserve currency, you can live beyond your means. You can effectively print the money which the rest of the world uses. So it has a huge benefit. And once the world begins to diversify, away from the US dollar, then all of this, there's less demand for this. Eventually, all of these dollars could be sent home, which have been exported over decades. So it's also a way for the United States to export its own inflation, because inflation is a form of taxation that is, producing new money and reducing the value of this existing one. So this effectively gives the US an opportunity to tax the entire world who holds these new dollars, because their dollar reduce in value while the Americans print new dollars, which, well, they're the one receiving. So this, obviously, the financial aspects is quite important. We also see within the physical transportation corridors, there's also, I guess, a great privilege to be to have the Navy, which controls the main maritime transportation corridor connecting world markets, because, it can be sold under ensuring the freedom of navigation. But what effectively the rest of the world knows, if it's on America's good side, it will have reliable economic connectivity. If they get on America's the wrong side, or not be disobedient, but lack of a better word, get on the bad side of America, they might risk their physical connectivity with other markets. So also here, with new transportation corridors not under US control, some of this incentive to cuddle up to the United States disappears. And lastly, it's on the strategic industries. This is if you control the main leading technologies, there's a slower diffusion. That is the benefit you have from being the innovator. You can extend that leading position much longer, because you can prevent these technologies from spreading too fast. When you have many competitors, there's a tendency then to shift power to the rest of the international system. So when you have two suppliers of key technologies, they have to compete for the customer. So suddenly the length of it's called the first mover advantage. It begins to be reduced. And also you see, by introducing more competition, strategic or new high-tech industries, which kind of function as a natural monopoly, given that there's less competition. You can't really diversify that well. Because of this, we see that it's higher economic gains from it, but also you can convert it into political influence, because if you want access to these key technologies, there's they can be put by political conditions on it. On the negative side, also through sanctions. So once the US loses now these key levers of geoeconomic power, we also see that they lose a lot of economic power, but also a lot of political power as well. So it's very, very significant. But of course, these are the negative. It could also have some positive effect.
Okay, I want to talk about those in a minute, but first I want to recap some of the key points there. And I think, what you began with, effectively the money expansion privilege that exists when you are the world reserve currency, because any country can expand their currency, and most do, right, to paper over their budget losses or their budget deficit. The difference for the United States is that they all get inflation. When you expand the money supply, you inflate. That's what's occurring. You pay more money for the same amount of product. But the difference when you control the reserve currency is that you can export a large percent of that inflation to other economies. So a government has to raise money. You really got two tools. You can raise taxes, collect more from the public, which causes the consumer's earnings to buy less because you keep less of your earnings. So that's why taxes hurt you and help the government. But money printing is effectively the same. Your money buys less because it's been devalued, and the government is able to put more cash in their coffers at the expense of life affordability. So taxes and money printing have pretty much identical impacts on the consumer base. The difference is that money printing allows the government, the United States government specifically, to export a large percent of that inflation to other economies who also transact in that same devalued US dollar. That was maybe a clunky recap, but my audience gets it. And my question for you was,
I think your choice of words were actually better. So
all right. I'll take that. So then my big question here, Glenn, obviously, you want to protect that privilege, because as long as you have that privilege, I mean, look, $36 trillion in debt, 2.4 trillion annual deficit. We're racking up new debt. We got to paper over those losses. It's like a business that's losing money. If you could just print more, you'd be just fine. The United States government can print more, so they can, in theory, kick this can down the road a lot further until they can't. And that's the big question for me. And I want to steal a piece from your recent Substack to lead into my question here. You said the next banking crisis will likely cause a dollar crisis, as the US cannot significantly increase the interest rate to save the dollar without sinking the economy. And it cannot significantly reduce the interest rate to save the economy without destroying the dollar. Can you expand on that statement for me? And I think that'll lead into what happens when we no longer have the privilege of money expansion.
Yeah, well, first, let me say, I think it is this unipolarity or global hegemony. It is transitional because it had to come to an end at some point, because it results in what's often referred to as imperial overstretch, when the strategic commitments, usually reference to military power, but also economic, goes beyond what the state can actually cough up. So you see now a gradual weakness. So the fact that the US is 35.5 trillion in the hole, I think close to 36 trillion now, perhaps, it is quite stunning. And even $1 trillion a year only in interest on this debt to service it. So it's quite significant. It's important to note how we got here, because back in the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, the US got into a lot of trouble because obviously it borrowed too much money and spent too much money. So what you would have wanted to see then would be some fiscal discipline. And again, this is one of the problems, if you will, of having the reserve currency. You don't necessarily need the fiscal discipline, as Greenspan and others keep saying on the news channels. We can just print if we get any trouble, so it's okay. So for this reason, the United States, it responded to the former global financial crisis of too much spending and too much borrowing by borrowing more and spending more. So it's been more than 15 years now. And with this very low interest rates, what we've seen is a lot of malinvestments. The debt obviously continued to increase. A lot of asset bubbles have been inflated simply because of the cheap money. And this is therefore put in place, I think, the conditions for a new banking crisis, as you just said. But the problem now is, I think, we spent some of the United States used some of its last tools in the last global financial crisis, because then it could reduce the interest rates very low. But now they also have a challenge with defending the dollar. So the problem now is obviously if the United States already experiencing huge inflation problems. So if they keep the interest rates too low, they might end up destroying their own dollar. And on the other hand, if they increase the interest rate, then they have to service a massive debt, and they might sink the economy. So this is effectively a dilemma, and a dilemma which keeps getting worse, by the way. So I also therefore made the point that something is obviously not wrong. Is wrong. This is not how capitalism was supposed to work. When stock markets go through the roof, but in the real economy, things just go worse and worse, and the middle class is beginning to be wiped out. Obviously, the stock market is not a good indicator of what's happening in the real economy. So I think there's a lot of problems. And when the bank crisis returns this time, I don't think it's possible to solve it by simply putting the interest rates low again. So I suspect for that reason a crisis in the dollar in the next banking crisis.
And when you say in the next banking crisis with such conviction, Glenn, I have to pull on that thread and say, I could guess, but what gives you that conviction, and just expand on that certainty for me a little bit.
Well, one should always be careful to be too certain, but there are countries do go through periods of some boom and bust, and I think we're due for another correction, and a big correction, I would say, because as I mentioned, the problems of 2008 and 9, it was never really resolved. I think there was a collapse in the housing market, and other asset bubbles were inflated. This is what happens when you reduce the interest rates. You reinflate new bubbles, but also a lot of malinvestments. So I think for this reason there would be a banking crisis coming, and we also see now that good indications that this might come sooner rather than later. As a lot of I'm not sure if the commercial real estate is doing worse than the private. Anyways, I think there's a lot of bad toxic debt building up in the system. But again, I want to be careful to put a timeline on when any of this would happen. But obviously, I think it's going to happen.
Well, and cyclicality in history would give you that. 87, 99, 2008. 2020 was a bit messy because there was a lot going on, but generally speaking, every 8 to 12 years this does occur. It's funny. I'm one of the businesses I'm involved with now is looking towards a transaction, and their time horizon is 3 years. And 2 advisors they've spoken with now have said you need to figure out a way to do your 3-year plan in 1.5 or 2 years, because inevitably we will see one of these corrections again. We see it every 8 to 12 years. It's impossible to time when, and the nature of these massive corrections is that you don't see them coming until they're right in your face. But when they occur, liquidity for transactions of companies your size is gone for 3, 5, 7 years. And so the longer you push out this goal, the higher risk you end up in that correction environment, and there's no bidders for a business like yours.
I think the Austrian School of Economics, they offer some very reasonable criticism of Keynesian economics in terms of the business cycle, where we're pushing the interest rates low, inflating bubbles, seeing the crash. So you go through this boom bust cycle, and it's I like how you framed it as well. This happens with almost scientific precision in terms of the periods.
Yeah. Now, the United States is not the only major superpower that's been firing a stimulus bazooka. And this is more recent news, but China opened up a very aggressive stimulus package in the last month. One at the scale of which they haven't since 2008. They were much more fiscally responsible, maybe you could say, for the last 16 years when the United States wasn't. I'd love to know your thoughts on that, because you can make the claim that, America was printing money, China was printing condos, right, and building these ghost cities and stimulating in different ways. And that's now manifested in this big real estate crash. But they're coming to the rescue of that real estate crash by dropping mortgage rates, by dropping down payment requirements, by funding bank loans specific for corporations that want to buy back their own stock. I mean, those 2 activities alone kind of tell you, almost like the Fed put, right? The Chinese government's going to step in and safeguard the equity market and the real estate market. And the Chinese equity market responded with a massive surge because investors could pile back in, knowing that there was all of a sudden a ton of cash available for companies to protect their share price. Very sort of American monetary fiscal policy right there. But there's a lot more to it than that. There was another 2 trillion yuan that was injected directly into regional governments to subsidize infrastructure projects. 1 trillion yuan of that money went direct to households to incentivize consumers to sell or get rid of their existing appliances and buy new, more sort of renewable energy or smart tech-based appliances, whether that's refrigerators, washing machines, toilets, buy smart toilets. So they're really incentivizing they're incentivizing consumption in a very big way, and they're putting some stop measures in place for the equity market and the real estate market. And this is going to come at a cost too, because we're talking about, the 2008 stimulus package was called the 4.5 trillion yuan bazooka when it was fired. It ended up being 9.5 trillion yuan over 27 months by the time it was done. And that's largely what fueled the whole China growth story. It wasn't just urbanization. It was government-funded urbanization. And we might be walking back into that now. Are you following that, Glenn? And if so, what's your take on the Chinese stimulus package and how that may impact this this transition to multipolarity?
Well, I think what they're going for, obviously, is a bit of a soft landing from the problem they have walked into, and there's also been, some success in terms of deflating a housing bubble. But all of that being said, I think, well, at least in my opinion, I think the Chinese are making a mistake. I think they should let the market, do what it does and correct these mistakes and. Avoid, as you called it, the American system where you effectively throw good money after bad. They seem to have taken this path anyways. I think they understand probably the dangers of not continuing their fiscal discipline. But I think it most likely has some political reasoning. That is, China has been a lot of its success has been almost unstoppable growth and progress for decades now. The population has come to expect it. We haven't really seen China yet in a decline. How would the political situation work? And there's also in China at all times there's some regions where there's always risk of some social upheaval. Again, not unlike the United States, there's a need to keep things going somewhat smoothly. So I think everything from political legitimacy problem, the expectation of the population that their economy will grow a few percentage points, 4 or 5 at least a year. All of this, I think, has contributed to this departure, if you will, away from fiscal discipline. So, I think it's a mistake, but of course, I would love to be wrong.
Sure. Now, let's maybe pivot towards a few of the conflict zones that we're watching around the globe right now, and obviously we're watching the war in Europe, we're watching the escalating war in the Middle East. And then the third, maybe hotspot, I don't know if you would call it that, but the South Pacific and Taiwan, increasing military training exercises around the island of Taiwan by the Chinese Navy. A lot of my guests, right here, Elbridge Colby, was on my show recently. I'm just reading his book right now. He's most concerned about the South China Sea as the biggest threat to America and the biggest conflict that we may see in our lifetime. And then I hear very counter opinions to that as well, saying, no, this is completely misunderstood and China's never overtly attacked a neighbor, ever. They're not going to this time either. That's using an American mindset to analyze a Chinese problem, and it's just wrong. What's your take? Global conflicts right now, we can go any direction you want to, Glenn. What strikes you as the most significant and catching your attention?
Well, I think both the war in Europe as well as the one growing now in the Middle East are closely tied to the hegemonic project that is after the Cold War to establish a unipolar system. This is why in Europe it manifested itself as the need to create a Europe without Russia, the largest state in Europe. So for this reason, this is why we abandoned our collective or inclusive security architecture in favor of instead expanding NATO to include everyone except the Russians. So this very predictably triggered a new Cold War, and also very predictably by people such as the current director of the CIA triggered a war in Ukraine. So this was, I think, also very, very much predicted by many people. I think the same in the Middle East. I don't think Israel had the incentives to make many concessions with the other nations in the region, given that they always had unconditional support by the all-powerful United States without any rivals. And I think this led to some political miscalculations. For example, not constructing a Palestinian state. I think this is very problematic because in this greater Israel area, how do you create a Jewish ethno-state when they're only half the population? It's going to result likely in some form of apartheid or ethnic cleansing, simply because there's not any other alternatives. So also the lack of need to find political settlement with neighbors does mean that Israel is all wrong, all its neighbors are all innocent. It's just, I think this is a key variable in terms of why political settlements were not reached. In terms of Asia, you can also add Korea, again, North Korea in this, because as the U.S. Escalates the war against Russia, Russia's pursued a horizontal escalation where it's cooperating more now with militarily with Iran, but also weapons deals with North Korea. Only today they apparently blew up some of their own roads on their own territory going into South Korea. So again,
That's
not
right.
direct attack on the South Koreans, but also it's seen as a continued a growing rise of tensions. But I would agree that of all this crisis, while the Russian one obviously puts us on the brink to nuclear war, the most dangerous one besides that would probably be China, because this is also the main economic rival to the United States. And for that reason, there's also likelihood that both sides would be willing to take immense risks. Now, in terms of the invasion of Taiwan, I don't see the Chinese doing it in a vacuum. That is, if they can choose, they would not want to do this. And the simple reason why is they do consider Taiwan to be a part of China, but so does most of the world, including the United States, recognizes that Taiwan is a part of China. So, so they see they want to reintegrate Taiwan, but they don't necessarily see it as being necessary to use military force, because China's position in that part of the world is strengthening every day. So they assume that having a peaceful integration of Taiwan as China's economic power becomes overwhelming is more likely. And even if one day it will be necessary to use military force, why do it today when tomorrow the relative power of the Chinese military vis-a-vis the American would be improved? So China effectively has an incentive to push this problem into the future. So the way I see it, the main thing for China, why they would use military force, is if the United States would take the step of pushing for the secession of Taiwan. And over the past few years, we've seen some movements in this direction. That is, the US now sends this is breaching a lot of the agreements which they had since the 1970s for the One China policy. Keep in mind, back in those days, Jimmy Carter made the point that, yes, we recognize Taiwan is a part of China, and for this reason, we will limit ourselves to economic and cultural ties. But now we see top American political figures going to Taiwan. We see American military trainers in Taiwan, so no longer hiding it. There's some pressure to have greater representation for Taiwan at the UN. So overall, there's the Chinese interpret all of this as the Americans chipping away at this one China policy and pushing for secessionism. And they might be wrong, but again, if the Chinese incentive is to push this into the future, I think the Americans have an interest in resolving this today, given that their relative power vis-a-vis the Chinese is more in America's favor today as opposed to 5 years from now. So I think it can go either way at this moment, but this is a situation that obviously gets more and more dangerous.
I want to unpack that a little bit, but I want to start with where you started, which was in Europe, and kind of walk through the new alliance, the new axis, if you want to call it that. That might be premature, but you mentioned Russia, Iran, North Korea, China. There's definitely coordination occurring, at least from a weapons and increasing the economic standpoint. But getting back to the comment you made about the creation of a European state without Russia, that statement made me think a lot. And one thing we talk about frequently is how the United States continue to increase pressure on the borderlands of Russia, knowing that this was going to corner Russia and probably invoke a response, because you push somebody up against a wall enough, eventually they'll take a swing at you just for self-preservation. And if you look at the history of Russia, the borderlands are why Russia was never fell, right? That's why Mussolini didn't make it to Moscow. That's why Hitler didn't make it to Moscow, because Russia's massive, and that massively expansive land is what kept enemies at bay. You remove those borderlands and then you flip them into Western allied nations. That's a real problem. And I think, first of all, if I'm way off base, let me know. But if I were to put myself in the mind of Vladimir Putin, it's like, he knows his history. He knows Russian history far more than the West understands it. And so from his standpoint, he was being cornered. He was being pushed against the wall. And, this was you could look at this as a self-preservation tactic. Now, a lot of people disagree with me. I've had the former Prime Minister of Canada on this podcast, and he's like, no, Russia is a gas station run by the mafia, and it's not more than that. You're overthinking this, right? This is Prime Minister Harper. And so I'm not saying that I understand it, but my question for you, here's where I'm at, is what, as far as you understand, Glenn, what was the why? Why add this pressure? Why create a European state without Russia? Why blackball Russia like this, right? You look at the humanitarian rights record, whatever, but you can apply that to so many countries, including the Ukraine. Lots of corruption, lots of human rights crimes, you could say. What's with the animosity and the European state without Russia? Why Russia? What's behind this from a Western standpoint?
Well, first let me address this comment of this, Russia being this gas station masquerading as a country or run by mafias. This was, I think, one of the self-delusions, which is why when we imposed these sanctions on Russia, the assumption, especially here in Europe, was that the Russian economy would collapse before the weekend. And again, now 2.5 years later, we see that Russia is the fourth largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. That is in accordance to the World Bank. They're growing much faster than most of the other Europeans. So obviously, we're going to have to reassess some of those portrayal of Russia. Now, in terms of the concerns that Putin had, you mentioned concerns about Ukraine. When you said it, it made me think of the former head of the British MI6, because he had something similar to say. He said, Putin is obviously a religious man, so every night when he goes to bed, he probably prays, to God, why didn't you put some mountains in Ukraine, some natural barriers, because this wide open plain has always been the main entry point to invade deep into Russia. So be it the Poles, the Swedes,
and I should mention, I said Mussolini. I meant Napoleon.
I thought maybe. The Italians joined in on some of the invasion with the Germans in the Second World War, so you're not off. But I thought Napoleon is obviously well known for this. So this is why Ukraine has always been considered to be an entry point. This is why it's always been important for Russia to ensure that Ukraine at least remains a buffer, which is why all of the NATO expansion rounds, Ukraine was always the most critical one. And this is why William Burns, the current director of the CIA, he even predicted in 2008, if we try to pull Ukraine into NATO, it would likely trigger a civil war, which he was correct. And he also argued that this would be unacceptable to the Russians, and they would likely have a military intervention. And he added, this is not something that Russians want to do, but they would feel they have no other choice. Because a little bit like the Chinese or the Russians placing their military in Mexico on the border of the United States. Sure. It's simply they can't afford to have NATO positioned on its borders. This is seen as something that would cut off Russia completely from Europe and push them into Asia. So this was never going to happen. And again, these days it's portrayed as being Russian propaganda. But it's worth keeping in mind that in January of 1994, even President Bill Clinton pointed out that if we do expand NATO, this risks redividing the continent and reviving the Cold War. And William Perry, that is his U.S. Secretary of Defense, he even considered quitting his job in opposition to this. And also he pointed out that most people in the administration agreed with him that this was a huge mistake that would alienate the Russians. But no one really disagreed with it. It was just that everyone thought Russia was weak and they were getting weaker, so no one had to care about alienating Russia. I guess the best foresight or prediction came from the great American diplomat George Kennan, who then predicted in 1998 that at some point Russia would push back against this threat of a NATO expansionism, and then we would blame the Russians for the conflict. So again, very much spot on. But why did we do this? I think when the Cold War came to an end, in '89, we effectively had two tracks. We could either accept a multipolar system, and in Europe that would mean have an inclusive European security architecture. And we actually had those agreements in 1990. That is the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. We were going to have a Europe without borders, without dividing lines, not borders we would have, but no dividing lines, and we would have based on indivisible security. So one side wouldn't expand its security at the expense of the other. But if you have Russia inside Europe, then the alliance system breaks down, because the hegemon often relies on an alliance system, because this is when your allies become dependent on you and your adversary can be weakened. If Russia's accepted into Europe, in other words, peace breaks out, alliances tend to wither away. And this was a key challenge. So that's why the expansion of NATO was seen as an effort to create a hegemonic Europe. And this is what it did. This is our almost the mantra now in NATO is, NATO is the main institution to represent Europe, and Russia should have no veto over NATO. Well, this is sometimes we don't think enough how absurd this proposition is, because suggesting the largest state in Europe should not have any say, how could this possibly be a recipe for peace, or redividing the continent, militarizing these dividing lines, and gradually pushing them towards Russian borders? It was predictable that this would result in conflict. But as we see, when institutions no longer reflect the actual distribution of power, what can they do? Do we simply say no veto for Russia, and now Russia will withdraw and accept NATO, US troops on these borders? No, of course not. If they don't have an institutional veto, they will use their military veto. This is a saying: if the Chinese build military bases in Mexico and America's borders, they say, well, if America can't veto it through an institution, the Americans will veto it through military force. So this is, again, why so many people predicted this war, and why it happened as well. So, so I think it was all, some of them probably had good intentions. That is, if you have a hegemonic system, the assumption was that the international anarchy, that is the security competition between the main or the great powers, it would be mitigated. And it was also the assumption if America is the undisputed leader in the world, they could elevate the role of liberal democratic values and create a more benign world. So the US has always been a bit of a crusader state in this sense. So I think there were some good intentions there, but as we see it set in motion a lot of great power conflicts occurring as we now see.
I often think about like the concept of lost in translation. And, I said when referring to Taiwan that we're looking at that situation with an American mindset, but we're using an American mindset to analyze the Chinese problem. And the reason that fails is because I think specifically like where I'm based in North America, we live in countries with very short histories, a couple hundred years. That's it. And we're trying to analyze the decisions and strategies of nations with a couple thousand years of written history. I mean, China, 4,000 years of written history. And so the way we weigh historical events is just going to be different. I think it's a huge translation issue that we have between the new world and the old world, specifically North America and Europe, Asia.
Yeah. Well, if you see the Chinese very consistent periods over the past 200 years, that is in the mid-19th century, from the 1940s to the early 60s, they had two Opium Wars in which the British broke China, and also the other European imperial powers took advantage. Also the Russians, by the way, took huge territories from the Chinese. So, and this is after the Opium Wars. They had what they refer to as the century of humiliation. That is, they went from being one of the main leading states in the world to being effectively a third world country exploited by imperial powers. So this was 100 years of humiliation. Now, this was seen to come to an end with the communist revolution. That is when Mao took power. And then suddenly they were seen as Mao was able to break the imperial stranglehold over China. And then they had a 30-year period of restoring sovereignty, but just economic horror show, a humanitarian horror show, things going very poorly for the Chinese. And then in the late 1970s, 79, the Chinese went, so after 30 years, they went into this period of now opening up, that is doing these market reforms, and they were slowly building up their internal strength because they had all the internal resources. They didn't have to focus that much abroad. So indeed, their main objective was to create as little attention as possible in international affairs. So don't create too much waves that would make other great powers try to limit their economic growth. They call this the peaceful rise. For me, I translate this simply into internal developments and avoiding or delaying other countries pushing back. And this also then lasted from 79 to 2009, again, another 30-year period. And at this point, this is when the global financial crisis comes. They look towards the United States. They don't trust their fiscal responsibility anymore. The Chinese look at the growing debt of the United States, their huge reserves that the Chinese have, as a challenge because they might not get their money back. The Americans become more uncomfortable with this interdependence with the Chinese because they see every year the productive power and foreign reserves of China keeps growing and growing, so it doesn't feel sustainable. And so this 30-year period then ends of peaceful rise in 2009. This is when the Chinese begin to express the need to develop a post-American world because the Americans weren't going to restore their fiscal discipline. If anything, they were blackmailing the Chinese to take on more debt by saying either take on more American debt or we'll print it and reduce the value of your existing investment. So this is when the Chinese began to openly challenge America's economic leadership in the world. So you saw the policy of China 2025 come out a few years later, in which they would try to dominate the main leading technologies commonly associated with the fourth industrial revolution. They also then began from 2013 to push trillions of dollars into this Belt and Road Initiative, which they're connecting the world through various infrastructure. And lastly, also around the same time, 2015, they developed this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative to the World Bank. And most of the world, all of America's allies, except for Japan, everyone joins. They begin to push for de-dollarization, the CIPS alternative to SWIFT, and gradually also encouraging new international institutions which attempt to facilitate then this decoupling from the United States and create an alternative international economic system. And this is also why BRICS are meeting this month, by the way. So there's a lot of things happening, but it's fascinating that, as you mentioned, this long historical time span. So 100-year of humiliation, then 30-year Mao, 30-year peaceful rise, and now they started this period of challenging America's dominance or unipolar system.
Which, if successful in the minds of I think many Chinese, would be a reversion to the mean. And you talked about the Opium Wars. And what's crazy is that I never learned about the Opium Wars in school. It wasn't talked about once. This is a key subject in Chinese secondary schools, right? It's a very important historical event. And prior to that, you had the Celestial Empire, as you mentioned. It was the most innovative and wealthy nation in the world. And even as the British Empire began to rise, China was known as the place where silver goes to die, because China wanted your silver, but they wanted nothing from you. And so if you wanted to trade with China, you just had to pay for things you couldn't really trade, because what they had was far superior to what they could buy from European industry. And that all changed, of course, with the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation. But, if you're reflecting on your country's history and you have, 2,000, 3,000 years of evidence of superiority and, innovative superiority, then you look at the last 150 years as a blip on the radar. We stumbled a little bit. right? Now it's time to get back to business. And regular business is that the Celestial Empire is the most dominant and innovative and wealthiest nation in the world. And it's important, I think, to understand that, because where I grew up, everything's Americanized through the lens of the American empire, right? It's obvious that Americans rule the world, and that's not going to change because it's obvious, right? Strongest military, biggest economy, blah, blah, blah. Let's not talk about how short this has been since it was the British Empire and the Dutch Empire and the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire, and how frequently the puck gets passed and how short these empires actually live for, because this is the world order and it will always be. I want to, any comments on that? I'd love to hear them, Glenn. Also, please.
If you see the language the Chinese are using today, it's quite obvious that they remember this history because, as again, for 2,000 years they're leading the world in terms of economic power. And what happened in the past, you had largely the large Eurasian continent was connected through this ancient Silk Road. But it was worth pointing out that it wasn't centralized. As the nomads who were traveling around it, they were, it went from A to B, B to C. So it wasn't a centralized control over this. And again, decentralized. And this broke down, and it was connectivity in the world was then replaced by the European maritime power. So it began from the early 16th century to connect the world through shipping, and in the process using this to establish their trade post empires and building colonies, empires, and slowly taking over the world. And of course, with the Industrial Revolution, then especially kicking in the early 19th century, the Chinese fell behind there as well, and they were overwhelmed. So again, by mid 19th century, they were crushed. And it's also interesting there was a self-reliance that they didn't really need that much from the Europeans, which is why the British had to push opium, and that this was a key problem. Anyways, if you forward today, what do they try to do? Well, with the BRICS and these other systems, they try to redevelop the connectivity across this greater Eurasian landmass, but they also, again, seek to have it decentralized, not all from Beijing, not because they're necessarily better people than us, but simply because if they try to centralize it, the other centers of power would push back. So they're embracing this decentralization. They're even referring to this New Belt and Road Initiative as the New Silk Road. So we also see this in the Arctic, by the way, because now all the other Arctic states besides Russia, which is half the Arctic territory, are NATO countries. And we suspended all cooperation with Russia in the Arctic. So now Russia's reaching out to the Chinese, Indians, and even Arabs to cooperate in the Arctic. And the Chinese actually included this conceptually into this ancient Silk Road concept by referring it to the Polar Silk Road. So a lot of this is building on what existed in the past, of course, with the very modern, the new technologies and current realities. But it is worth looking at the language the Chinese use to point out this very long historical memory and framework.
Now one piece of communication that's come directly from President Xi has been that he wants his military to be ready for a successful takeover of Taiwan by 2027. That's not the same as saying he's going to take over Taiwan. What he said is he wants his military to be ready for a successful takeover. I want to use that maybe, and you made a comment about how it's in China's best interest to wait, because as time goes on, they will continue to get stronger while America gets weaker, and their advantage will increase. Now, the devil's advocate to that would be, well, China's getting old before they're getting rich. Their demographics are a disaster. Now, many developed countries, if not all, have serious demographic issues, but China's got some of the worst. In addition, their economy is very propped up right now. Yes, America's is too, but America has the world reserve currency. China has now been forced to fire the stimulus gun to float their real estate market, to float their stock market. And they're in a lot more trouble than we understand. And this could be a paper tiger moment, like when we thought the Soviet Union was a legitimate competitor on the world stage until the day they were not. And that it's in China's best interest, therefore, to act now, because their advantage will depreciate over time for the reasons I just discussed. I've heard that perspective a few times from a few guests, so I wanted to put that in front of you and get your thoughts on it, Glenn.
Yeah, well, but let me first point out that the role of the United States to contain China. This is again also seen in the historical context, as we discussed before, with the Opium Wars and then the century of humiliation. This was seen to end then after the Second World War, when the communists began to take over in China. Now, what was interesting then is the U.S. Took over what they saw as the imperial role. That is, after the Second World War, or in the early 50s, the United States set up a containment policy against the Chinese. That is, Secretary of State Dulles. He conceptualized these two island chains outside of China, so going from Japan down through Philippines, and you have two of these island chains. So this was seen to attempting to contain China. And this is something they also complained even after the Cold War. That is, even when the U.S. Began to open up and work with them, trade to them, refer to them as partner, they saw the containment policies as never ending. So this is something that continued to bother them. And I forgot your question again. I apologize.
Well, it's disputing the idea that
demographics.
Best interest to wait. Yes, some would say China will be stronger in 5 years, so they should wait. Others would say no, China will be weaker for those reasons. They got to go now if they're going to go. Kind of like when Japan struck Pearl Harbor. They knew if they were going to strike and have any chance, they had to go then. They couldn't wait. They were out of resources, and they had to make their move, ready or not. That's the question.
Yeah, no, I think the demographic problem is a real one in China. Not just, as you mentioned, China, but the entire world. This is a wider problem with modernity. That is, every year, more and more countries are dropping into negative birth rate. You need effectively 2.1 children per woman in order to merely maintain the existing population. An irony which goes back to what Emile Durkheim observed in France during the Industrial Revolution there was, the more a country developed, the more the social problems began to build up. So if you look at South Korea, for example, they have now 0.82 kids per woman, which is they are really leading this collapse. And this is often accompanied by other problems as well, which comes with modernity, which is a lack of meaning, lack of societal cohesion, growing suicides, but of course the failure to reproduce your population. Now, this will also be a problem in China. They have, I think they probably begun to regret the one-child policy, but their population will also shrink, and this will have a problem on the economy, social cohesion. Again, most of the world, because a declining population is an issue we haven't really dealt properly with since the Middle Ages. So it's going to be a huge problem for the Chinese. But for the time being, I don't see them being in a great rush because their economy is still growing. These problems haven't really begin to be felt greatly yet. Doesn't mean I dismiss it as a problem in the future. I think it definitely will be. And But for the time being, I think they're still looking to delay this as much as possible. Yes. So, but of course, I could be wrong. They might see this as better to solve today. But if you see how quickly the Chinese are now militarizing as well, how many ships they're able to build, their drone technology, how it's advancing, how the relative military power in that region is growing rapidly now. So not just economically surpassing the United States, but also militarily developing very, very quickly. This is a key problem why often it's important to look at purchasing power parity, because the amount of military output the Chinese can produce compared to what the Americans can do in money is just immense. It's not an unreasonable counter argument which you have.
Yeah, and then on the birth rate front, again, it's hard because you never know if you can trust the data, and I can't recall what the reported birth rate is in China. It's like 1.9 or something, but speculated that it's a lot lower than that. And really, it's like, who's to know? Part of that stimulus package that we talked about earlier, what is it? 40,000 yuan per month go to supporting families who have a second or third child. So they're directly incentivizing further births. I mean, in the West, we have demographic issues too. I don't know what the birth rate is in Canada right now. I'll tell you what though, Glenn, There's not a birth rate crisis if you go to church. That's where all the big families are. I got 3 kids, and I swear every Sunday, that's where I see all the families who are still having 3 kids. It's no birth crisis there.
Well, that's yeah, me too. Also 3 kids, but no, but I agree, and I think this is why, as the economies continue to grow and modernize, I think political economy has to incorporate more ideas from sociology, because, as I mentioned, this is a key problem with modernization. Well, simply in the past, kids had a pragmatic reason. But these days they become almost like expensive pets. But it doesn't mean that there's not a human instinct that requires it. No, but I think the abandonment of religion, the family as an institution, I think a lot of this is a curse of modernity as well. So I think there's a need to appreciate what we're abandoning from the pre-modern world. And yeah, I've been a few years in a row at the central bank in Hungary for this Eurasian Economic Conference they have in October once a year. And I find it fascinating, because then when the head of the central bank speaks on stage, you expect him to talk about interest rates, but instead you see him talk about, well, we have to think what kind of society we're developing. We need to make sure we're building a family that builds on our Christian foundation, one that incentivizes instead of disincentivize having large families. So you should have kids. So trying to make sure that the society doesn't merely become an appendage to the economy is quite important. I was a professor in Moscow, and there as well, if you have 3 kids, you're considered a large family. Suddenly you don't pay for public transportation, museums, going to the zoo. You get dairy products for free. So so they have all this effectively trying to reverse, making sure that you're not worse off by having kids. So they want to have an economic system that incentivizes the big family, that tries to reward restoration of Christianity. Because they find that if you have, the more people trust or identify themselves as Christians, the more likely they're to get married earlier. They stay married, they have more children. The children grow up with fathers, they don't do drugs, they get more productive, less social problems, better productivity, more stability. So there's a political economic aspect to preserving this tradition. So I very much big supporter of introducing more sociology into the political economy.
That's really interesting. And just from a personal growth standpoint, that they say the 2 most transformative experiences in your life are the birth of your first child and the death of a first parent. To rob yourself of one of those experiences, I mean, it's do whatever you want, but we should strive for growth. And having children's really, really tough. It's such a struggle, right? But it's worth it. Right? The hardest battles in life are always worth it. I didn't know about these incentives. I feel a bit cheated, because once you have a 3rd kid in Canada, you just pay a lot more for everything.
Yeah, it's the same in Norway.
Right. Yes.
It doesn't really incentivize, but I think that this is a big mistake. So I think wider view of society is required. And I would recommend a book by Robert Putnam. He wrote Bowling Alone in America. He introduces also the concept then of social capital. That is, your grandparents would know everyone on the streets. Your parents would know the neighbor. You don't even know the neighbor. So you have fewer people. The individual becomes more atomized in as the world develops, and this has huge consequences. People don't vote that anymore. They don't trust the people around them. They have fewer people to rely on. And I was getting to your point before. If you go to church, and they find that people who go to church, they're part of a community. There's greater trust. Someone has a small child, they're lacking resources, others donate to them, and for this reason, this surveys I did of Christians in America, they found that they were more likely to vote, more likely to give to charity. They felt more connected to the people around them. So I think these things are very important. The social structures, because human beings are a social animal, and all of the economic institutions push for only radical individualism. So something worth countering there. And as you said, with the Chinese, you can measure everything: military power, economic power. But if you neglect that, people aren't having kids anymore, all of this falls apart. If there's no meaning anymore, no willingness, no energy and drive behind the civilization, everything begins to collapse very quickly.
So I want to maybe move from here a short step over to what will oddly probably end up being our most controversial topic, which is the topic of free speech. We can talk about war, we can talk about oppression and economic sanctions, etc. We can talk about that stuff. It's fine, right? You want to talk about free speech? Now we're in the red zone. But you were recently removed from YouTube as a platform, and have since been reinstated. YouTube came out and said, "Look, we made a mistake. We accused you of hate speech. We were wrong." Hopefully, that's what the letter said. Hopefully they apologized. Who knows? But it's front and center right now. It's very front. And I want to use something I've heard you say to frame this, which is, governments and politicians will censor speech with the message that we are trying to prevent propaganda. That's why we need censorship, to prevent propaganda. I've heard you say, well, actually, free speech is the antidote to propaganda. That's completely backwards. And I would define free speech as allowing people you don't like to say things that you don't like. That's what real free speech is. It's the stuff you don't want to hear, that you don't want to be said, but you allow to be said. That's sort of the litmus test. I just maybe leave that open for you, Glenn. Any comments on the subjects that you want to share today?
Yeah, well, on the YouTube incident, it's also combined with the technologies we have, because it's quite concerning. They have a strike system if you promote hate speech. I didn't have any strikes, so they just took me off immediately without a warning, only an automated email saying severe and repeated hate speech, so we had to delete all of it right away. And I thought it was strange because I don't hate anyone. I have never pushed any hate on my channel. Indeed, the most people I interview on this channel will be American leaders like Jack Matlock and Chas Freeman. They kind, soft-spoken people, so it doesn't make any sense. But this was nonetheless the case. And then some friends or colleagues also began to complain a bit. And then suddenly I got an email saying, "Oh, there was no hate speech after all. Here's your account back." So, and again, all automated. So you never talk to a person. So this can be a bit concerning, especially for people who rely on these digital platforms for a living. But overall, I'm very concerned about how free speech, is one of our most sacred values. Indeed, we don't define our collective identity anymore based on common faith or even tradition or culture anymore. We seem to, our main identity is being liberal, and this is liberalism is a good value, but it seems like a lot of our most sacred values, such as free speech, can be overturned very, very quickly. And by simply suggesting, well, free speech, we have to protect democracy from hate speech or propaganda, but this is. Historically, it's been wrong. If you look at the main literature at propaganda, which came out in the 1920s and 30s, there was a great consensus that, as you said, bad ideas have to be countered with good ideas. So there were suggestions, Churchill should have debated, that came later, Churchill should debate Stalin, for example, that this is how you get the propaganda out of this. And I agree with it, because the referring to propaganda as a reason for censoring, this is indeed a propagandistic approach on its own. So it's been a scary incrementalism, because if you remember back in 2018, that's when they took out Alex Jones, and it's very clever, because this was a minor case. He's a fringe person. I guess you can call some of his speech, especially Sandy Hook, to be quite appalling. So it's like a fringe figure, seen as an exception. They deplatform him, and only over the past 6 years, this language of deplatforming, it's entered the vocabulary now. We just hear people getting knocked off for saying the wrong thing. It's quite obvious that the platforms have different political agendas. Mark Zuckerberg himself said that he shouldn't have censored the Hunter Biden laptop, which was apparently real, had nothing to do with the Russians, by the way. He admitted that they censored COVID information, which was real, also humor, satire. So the censorship, I think, has gone way out of control, and the most dangerous aspect is become normalized. This idea that free speech is not a right anymore. But yeah, so no, it's a very concerning path, and it's definitely not in our interest, because the best, when you're on the wrong path, and I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, the collective West, that is, and the best thing you can do to adjust to in a situation in the world is to have course correction, and this comes from free speech, not to have the government set up this ministry of truth of fact checkers, which are checking narratives. It's a very, very dark turn, and I just can't see why this would be in our interests.
No, definitely not. And it's a tricky one, though, isn't it? In that, should free speech be allowed on YouTube? Intuitively, I say absolutely, but I don't own YouTube, right? I own a couple of businesses myself, and they're not democracies. They're inside my company. I make the decisions, and I give my people a lot of autonomy, but I set the vision, I set the rules, and then, and then I hire great people, and in theory, I get out of their way and let them perform, and that works very, very well. But since it's my company, I should have the right to run it however I want to. And if I want to enact poor, short-sighted policies, that's only going to hurt me as the operator, but it is still my discretion. I mean, that's my right as the risk taker who started the business and is now running it, right? So when you have a major platform like Google, YouTube, you sort of qualify it the same and say, well, it's Larry Page's company. He should be able to do whatever he wants. But then you get to a scale where the platform is sort of like a public utility, right? It's almost like a phone line. Like, I don't know, at what scale do you say it's different now, right? It's different now. And maybe now different rules should apply, and it shouldn't just be the discretion of one individual who controls such a massive, massive distribution machine. But then you get into the question of, okay, well, who's going to provide the oversight, right? Like, who can we trust here to step in and actually protect the best interest of the public and not have an internal motivation or incentive, And definitely not the government. I don't want the current elected government to be the one to step in and say, we'll tell you what's right and what's wrong. So it's really muddy, right? There may just not be a solution. It's one of those things where there's not like a binary solution here, but it is a tricky one, isn't it?
Well, it's very tricky because, one has to try to be nuanced and also recognize that these new technologies, they come with some problems. And obviously the disinformation, manipulation in the digital space, even by trimming algorithms, there's a lot of opportunities to destabilize society with disinformation. And if you see the technologies coming in now with deepfakes, I can make a video seemingly being you saying outrageous thing and put it out on the internet. I see that there has to be some way of, it can't be either one or the other, that there has to be some control. But on the other hand, yes, in the United States, they had a sitting president in 2020 being deplatformed on Twitter. In the EU, you had the EU, we call them the censorship czar, or digital for enforcer, something like this is called. He sent a letter to Elon Musk because Elon Musk was going to interview Donald Trump. He sent a letter before the interview because the interview was going to be live, and asked him not to broadcast it because to protect from hate speech and disinformation. The interview hadn't even happened yet. It was a form of pre-crime or pre-censorship. Yeah. You think he's going to say something bad, censor him. So this is going to show this can't be the solution either. So I don't really have any good answers how to resolve this problem, but it has. It deserves more attention, but it also shows a wider problem, which is that as more and more power concentrates in these digital platforms, these platforms will either get immense political power over the politicians, or the politicians can try to control these platforms. But either way, you're going to have some merger of corporations and state, in which leaves the individual severely weakened in what is very reminiscent of a fascist political economy. And this is only now with the digital platforms controlling communication, but as we see now with the fourth industrial revolution, in which digital technologies can increasingly manipulate the physical world, these same digital platforms will take over, transportations, smart cities, smart production, everything of automation. So they're getting more and more larger societal roles. So this concentration of power is a huge problem. It puts the entire capitalist system, in which there's assumed there's a balance between capital and labor. All of this is coming under pressure. So we have what to do with these tech giants is a great question.
You know, that brings up, like, for me and probably for you, the importance of optionality if you're going to be providing analysis and opinions to the public. And that means, like, not just be here, but be there as well. And, you know, a great insurance policy for anybody is to write direct newsletters, actually, that go direct to the recipient and all of this. And I've had my weekly newsletter available for 7 years. Initially, it was like an insurance policy, Glenn. It was like, well, this is the one that cannot be plucked. It's direct to the consumer. If I have an issue with this platform, I can just take the list to that platform and I can keep business rolling, which is the segue into your Substack, because it's a great read. And thank you for writing it. And I'd encourage everybody to look up Glenn Diesen on Substack. And anywhere else, where should I point people to, Glenn? Because I've really enjoyed this conversation and your perspective, and I'm sure my audience has as well. So I want to send them where they can hear more from you. Where should they go?
Well, I'm on Substack. I put both articles I write as well as most of the interviews we do, because we do interviews of different world leaders, so political, economic, military, and so all of this goes on Substack. I also have a presence on the X or Twitter, but I'm trying to go more towards Substack, to be honest. But either Twitter or Substack would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, Glenn, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on. I'd love to do it again in the future, but have fun in Italy. I know they're working you like crazy. Glenn's at a conference today in Italy. He's on stage for 3 days straight, talking security, probably among other things. But I appreciate your time today, Glenn.
Thank you.